The activities of the apostles. The content of the four Gospels is the earthly life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The book Acts of the Apostles, the fifth book in the New Testament, focuses on events from the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles after Jesus' ascension into heaven to the initial stage of the church spreading to various parts of the world. In the Holy Scriptures, the Greek word praxis is used for the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts were also written by St. Luke, who wrote the third Gospel of the Holy Bible. Both books begin by addressing a person named Theophilus and use the same narrative style and language. When St. Luke concludes his Gospel with the ascension of Jesus Christ and the promise of the Holy Spirit, the Acts of the Apostles begins with the ascension and the coming of the Holy Spirit. In other words, where the Gospel ends, the Acts of the Apostles begin. He himself testifies that what he wrote is a continuation of the second part of his Gospel, called the Acts of the Apostles, Acts 1 verses 1 to 4. The title of the Book of Acts, is also known as the Acts of the Apostles. The Greek word praxeus is also used in Syriac. Praxeus is the Greek term for the apostles' works. When reading the title, one might think it refers to the deeds of all the apostles, but it actually describes only the works of St. Peter and St. Paul among the apostles. Other than the contextual mention of the activities of the apostles James and John in the book, none of their other works are recorded. The purpose and objective of the book Acts of the Apostles is to testify to the universality of the Christian Church, which was begun and guided by the power of the Holy Spirit. The book portrays the beginning of the Christian faith, its systematic growth and development, and finally the process by which it spread to Rome. In this gospel work, emphasis is placed more on the message of those involved rather than their personal histories. Content-wise, it details the evangelization from the ascension of Jesus Christ to the deaths of the apostles Peter and Paul, as well as the living conditions of the early Christians. The events recorded here are those in which the message of salvation, which was initially meant only for the Jews, crossed the boundaries of countries and races and became universal. This book can be divided into two main parts. First, the activities that took place in Jerusalem and nearby regions under the leadership of St. Peter, from chapter 1 to 12. Second, the activities that took place outside Jerusalem under the leadership of St. Paul, from chapter 13 to 28. Many events are written in the first-person narrative, as witnessed by St. Luke. There is ample evidence within the book that he was a companion of St. Paul, chapter 16, verses 10 to 17, chapter 20, verses 5 to 21, chapter 21, verse 18, chapter 27, verses 1 to 26, chapter 28, verse 16. Since the word "we" is used throughout these sections of particular importance to St. Paul, it can be assumed that the author was present with St. Paul during these occasions. Although the main activities in the Acts of the Apostles are carried out by St. Peter and St. Paul, it is evident that the author gives more importance to St. Paul's speeches and missionary journeys. The changes brought about by the gospel in the believers and, consequently, the transformation in the social structure are clearly highlighted. It can be seen that all members of the church lived as a community, giving up private property, and doing so with joy and generosity. Another important feature is that the administration of the church's material wealth and the leadership of spiritual ministry are separated. While the apostles engaged in prayer and the ministry of the word, selected ministers were assigned the responsibility of managing the community's material arrangements. St. Luke reveals how Christianity separated itself from the Jewish religious system as a distinct path. This departure begins with the declaration at the Jerusalem Sanhedrin that circumcision, which was an inviolable law for the Jews, is not necessary for a Christian. The apostles emphasized this new vision that purity of the heart is more important than circumcision of the body. Similarly, there is also a description of how Christian thinking diverges from Jewish philosophy regarding social customs. The Jerusalem temple and sacrifices become irrelevant concerning Christians. Throughout, one can see the image of Christians transforming into a community living together with unity of mind. Meanwhile, the temporary conflicts that arise are resolved through Sanhedrians at that time. A significant portion of the content concerns the sufferings and persecutions that early church members had to endure. However, St. Luke shows how the Church survives all this and grows and develops through the power of the Holy Spirit. The author never reveals his own name anywhere. However, in Colossians 4 verses 14 and 2 Timothy 4:11, and Philemon 23-25, the Holy Paul refers to St. Luke. He was a physician and was not a Jew. St. Luke is the only non-Jewish writer among the authors of the New Testament books. Eusebius, the church historian, has testified that he was a Greek. The picture of the Blessed Virgin Mary painted by St. Luke is preserved in the Palace of Marcus in Jerusalem.